The distant howl of a lone wolf echoed across the Montana prairie as Penelope Lawson knelt before two wooden crosses, her trembling hands pressing wildflower seeds into the freshly turned earth. Spring of 1877 had brought new life to the land, but for Penelope, it had only deepened the hollow ache that had taken residence in her chest since burying her husband and son 3 months prior. The early morning sun cast long shadows across the hillside cemetery as Penelope worked. Her once vibrant auburn hair hung limp beneath her bonnet, and dark circles rimmed eyes that had shed more tears than she thought possible. At 26, she wore the weight of widowhood like a shroud, her slender frame lost within the folds of her black mourning dress. "There you are, my loves," she whispered, patting the soil gently. "Soon there will be colors here. Robert always did love his wildflowers and little James." Her voice caught. He would have been so happy to see the butterflies they'll bring. She didn't hear the approaching hoofbeats until they were nearly upon her. Startled, Penelope rose quickly, nearly losing her balance as she turned to face the stranger. He sat tall in the saddle, silhouetted against the rising sun. A dusty black hat shadowed his face, but she could make out a strong jawline peppered with stubble beneath it. His duster bore the marks of long travel, and the horse beneath him, a magnificent chestnut quarter horse, looked nearly as trail-worn as its rider. "Beg your pardon, madam," the stranger said, his voice low and rough like gravel. "Didn't mean to startle you." Penelope straightened her back, one hand instinctively moving to the small knife concealed in her pocket. 3 months alone had taught her caution. "State your business, sir." The stranger dismounted with fluid grace that belied his size. Up close, she could see his eyes clear blue and startlingly kind in a face weathered by sun and wind. "Name's Yates Blackburn, madam, just passing through looking for work." He removed his hat and held it respectfully against his chest. "Saw you out here alone and wanted to make sure you were all right." "I'm quite fine, Mr. Blackburn," Penelope replied, though the tremor in her voice betrayed her. "As you can see, I'm just—" Her eyes drifted back to the graves, and suddenly the composure she'd fought so hard to maintain crumbled. She turned away quickly, unwilling to let a stranger witness her tears. Yates stood silent for a long moment, his gaze moving from the woman to the two graves, understanding dawning in his eyes. "They your family?" he asked quietly. Penelope nodded, not trusting herself to speak. "My condolences, madam. Losing family, it's the hardest thing there is." Something in his tone suggested he knew this truth firsthand. She wiped her eyes with a handkerchief and faced him again. "Thank you. Now if you'll excuse me, I should get back to my farm. There's work waiting." Yates glanced at her hands, reddened and calloused in a way that told him they hadn't been working land for long. "Your farm far from here, just beyond that ridge," she pointed west. "The small homestead with the red barn," he nodded, replacing his hat. "I noticed your fence was down on the south side when I rode past. Cattle could wander. If you'd allow it, I'd be happy to fix it for you. In exchange for a meal, perhaps." Penelope hesitated. Since Robert and James had died in the blizzard, strangers had come by with offers of help that usually ended with suggestions she couldn't run the place alone, that she should sell to them for a fraction of its worth. But there was something different in this man's eyes, no greed, just a simple offer of assistance. "I can pay you properly for work, Mr. Blackburn. I don't need charity." A slight smile touched his lips. "Wasn't offering any, madam, just honest trade work for food." After a moment, Penelope nodded. "Very well, you can follow me back." The walk to the homestead was silent, Yates leading his horse a respectful distance behind Penelope. She was acutely aware of his presence. It had been months since she'd had company beyond the occasional visit from the preacher's wife, who came bearing casseroles and pitying looks in equal measure. The Lawson farm was modest but well built, with a 2-room cabin, a sturdy barn, and about 40 acres of land. Robert had been ambitious, planning to expand to cattle once they'd established their crops, but the brutal winter had changed everything. Now a small vegetable garden, a few chickens, and 2 milk cows were all that remained of those dreams. "You can water your horse at the trough," Penelope said as they reached the yard. "Tools are in the barn. I'll prepare something for your midday meal while you work." Yates nodded and headed toward the barn, but paused halfway there. "Mrs. Lawson," he called, realizing he didn't know her name. "Penelope," she replied after a slight hesitation. "Penelope Lawson. Mrs. Lawson, that south fence, it'll need more than just mending. Few posts have rotted through." "I can replace them if you've got lumber," she sighed. "There's some in the barn that my husband cut before." She swallowed hard. "Before winter, use what you need." Inside the cabin, Penelope moved mechanically through the familiar tasks of making bread and stew. Through the window, she watched Yates work, his movements efficient and purposeful as he assessed the damaged fence, gathered tools, and began digging out the rotted posts. By midday, the aroma of stew filled the small cabin, and Penelope stepped onto the porch to call Yates for the meal. She found herself momentarily transfixed by the sight of him. He'd removed his duster and rolled up his sleeves, revealing forearms corded with muscle as he drove a new post into the ground. Sweat gleamed on his brow despite the cool spring air, and for the first time in months Penelope felt a flicker of something other than grief stir within her. She quickly quashed it, ashamed. "Robert was barely cold in his grave, Mr. Blackburn," she called. "Meal's ready when you are." Yates straightened, wiping his brow with his sleeve. "Be right there, madam, just let me wash up." At the table they ate in silence at first until Yates finally spoke. "This is mighty fine stew, Mrs. Lawson." "Thank you." She pushed a piece of potato around her bowl. "It was my husband's favorite." Yates nodded, understanding her need to speak of him. "How long were you married?" 7 years. "We came out here from Ohio 5 years ago. Robert had big dreams for this place." A sad smile crossed her face. "He was always full of dreams. And your boy?" Yates asked gently, Penelope's hand stilled. "James, he was 6, bright as a new penny and just as shiny." Tears threatened again, but she blinked them back. They went to town for supplies before the blizzard hit. The horse returned alone 2 days later. We found them a mile from home when the snow cleared. They tried to walk back. Yates set down his spoon, his appetite suddenly gone. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Lawson, truly." She nodded, then abruptly stood and began clearing the table. "Will you be able to finish the fence today?" "Yes, madam." "Be done before sundown." True to his word, Yates completed the fence repair by late afternoon. When he came to the door to report the work finished, Penelope handed him a small pouch of coins. "This is too much," he said, weighing the pouch in his palm. "It's fair," she insisted. "There's daylight left if you're heading to town." Yates glanced at the setting sun, then back to the lonely homestead. "Actually, Mrs. Lawson, I noticed your plow needs fixing before planting season. If you're amenable, I could stay on a few days, help with the heavier work." Penelope searched his face, looking for hidden motives but finding only honest offers. "Why would you do that?" Yates shifted his weight, suddenly looking less sure of himself. "Truth is, madam, I've been drifting since the war ended. Worked ranches from Texas to Wyoming, never staying too long in one place. But I'm getting tired of moving. Thought maybe I could work for room and board for a spell if you've got the space and the need." Penelope hesitated. Having a man around the farm would certainly help. There was more work than she could manage alone. But inviting a stranger to stay, "There's a small bunkhouse behind the barn," she said finally. "My husband built it hoping to hire help eventually. It's not much, but it's shelter." Relief washed over Yates's face. "That'll do just fine, madam. I appreciate it." That night, Penelope lay awake in her bed, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of another person on her property, the creak of the bunkhouse door, the soft murmur as he spoke to his horse. It was strange having someone else around, but she couldn't deny the small comfort it brought, knowing she wasn't entirely alone. The following days fell into an unexpected rhythm. Yates rose before dawn, tending to his horse and Penelope's livestock before she even emerged from the cabin. They would share a brief breakfast, Penelope gradually adding more to the table as she grew accustomed to cooking for two again, before tackling the day's work. Yates fixed the plow, mended the leaking roof, and helped prepare the fields for planting. Penelope found herself watching him often, noting the gentle way he handled the animals and the respect with which he treated Robert's tools. A week into his stay, Penelope approached the field where Yates was breaking ground for planting. "Mr. Blackburn," she called, shielding her eyes from the sun. He stopped the plow horse and turned to her. "Yes, Mrs. Lawson, I'm going to visit the graves. It's James's birthday." Her voice caught slightly. "I'd like to plant more flowers." Yates removed his hat. "Would you like company? Or would you prefer to be alone?" The question caught her off guard. Most people assumed grief was a private affair, something to be endured in solitude. I wouldn't mind company, actually." They walked to the hillside cemetery in companionable silence, Penelope carrying a basket with flower seeds and a small spade. When they reached the graves, she knelt down, touching the small wooden cross that marked her son's resting place. "He would have been 7 today," she said softly. He was so excited about having a birthday in spring, said it meant he was special because he was born when everything else was being born too. Yates knelt beside her, his presence solid and comforting. Sounds like a wise young man, he was. So much like his father, always curious, always planning. She began digging small holes around the grave markers. "I'm planting his favorites today, sunflowers and daisies." To her surprise, Yates took the spare trowel from her basket and began helping, carefully creating small depressions in the soil around Robert's cross. "My ma always said flowers help souls find their way to heaven," he said quietly. "Said they're like little beacons of light." Penelope smiled faintly. "I like that thought." She scattered seeds into the holes and covered them gently. "Robert proposed to me in a field of wildflowers back in Ohio. He said I was more beautiful than any bloom there." As they worked, Penelope found herself sharing more memories: James's first steps, Robert teaching him to fish, the Christmas when they'd been snowed in but made a feast from preserved foods. Stories she'd kept locked inside, too painful to revisit alone. Yates listened attentively, occasionally offering a story of his own about his childhood in Texas, his time as a cavalry scout during the war, the places he'd seen in his years of drifting. There was a gentleness to him that belied his rugged appearance, a patience that allowed Penelope to speak at her own pace. When they'd finished planting, Penelope sat back on her heels, surveying their work. "Thank you, Mr. Blackburn. This means more than I can say." "Yates," he corrected softly. "After all this, you might as well use my given name." "Yates," she repeated, the name feeling strange yet somehow right on her lips. Back at the farm, days turned to weeks as spring took firmer hold on the land. The fields were planted, the animals tended, and slowly the homestead began to thrive again under their combined care. Penelope found herself looking forward to their shared meals, to the quiet conversations that stretched longer each evening. One night as they sat on the porch after supper, watching fireflies dance in the gathering darkness, Penelope finally asked the question that had been on her mind. "Why did you stop that day, Yates? At the cemetery?" He was silent for a long moment, rocking gently in the chair Robert had built. "Truthfully, I wasn't planning to. I was just passing through looking for work at one of the bigger ranches." He gazed out at the darkening prairie. "But I saw you there, kneeling alone at those graves, and something just stopped me, made me get down from my horse." He turned to look at her, his face half illuminated by the lantern light. "I buried my wife and daughter 10 years ago. Yellow fever took them both in a week while I was away fighting. By the time I got home, they were already in the ground." Penelope's breath caught. "I'm so sorry." "For years after, I wished someone had been there with them at the end, someone to hold their hands, to make sure flowers grew on their graves." His voice was rough with emotion. "When I saw you planting those flowers all alone, I just thought, no one should have to do that by themselves." Without thinking, Penelope reached out and placed her hand over his. "Thank you for stopping. And for staying. His hand turned beneath hers, their fingers intertwining with a naturalness that should have frightened her but somehow didn't. "Thank you for letting me," he replied softly. The next morning, Penelope woke to the sound of hoofbeats approaching the farm. She hurried outside to find 3 riders entering her yard: Franklin Porter and his 2 sons from the neighboring ranch. Porter had been trying to buy her land since Robert's death. "Morning, Widow Lawson," Porter called, his tone falsely jovial. "Thought I'd check in, see if you've reconsidered my offer." Before she could respond, Yates emerged from the barn, pitchfork in hand. Porter's expression darkened. "Didn't know you had company, Mrs. Lawson," he said, eyes narrowing at Yates. "Mr. Blackburn works for me," Penelope replied firmly. "And my answer remains the same, Mr. Porter. The farm is not for sale." Porter dismounted, adjusting his gun belt in a way that wasn't quite threatening but wasn't friendly either. "Now see here, a woman alone can't manage a spread like this. It's just practical sense to sell before you run it into the ground." "She ain't alone," Yates said, stepping forward, "and the farm's doing just fine." "Is that so?" Porter looked between them, a sneer forming. "Folks in town might be interested to hear about the widow's new hired hand staying on the property." "Not proper, is it, boys?" His sons chuckled, and Penelope felt heat rise to her cheeks, partly from embarrassment, partly from anger. "Mr. Blackburn stays in the bunkhouse, and my arrangements are none of your concern," she said coldly. "Now, unless you've come to discuss something else, I'd appreciate you leaving my property." Porter's face flushed with anger. "You'll regret this, Mrs. Lawson. Land like this needs a man's touch, not some drifter playing cowboy." Yates took another step forward, his stance shifting subtly. Porter must have recognized the look in his eyes, the look of a man who'd seen combat, and wouldn't hesitate to defend what needed defending because he backed toward his horse. "We'll be going. But my offer stands until the end of the month. After that, don't come crying when the bank starts asking about your mortgage." After they'd ridden off, Penelope sank onto the porch steps, trembling slightly. "How did he know about the mortgage?" Yates asked, sitting beside her. "Robert borrowed to expand last year. The payments are manageable if the crops come in, but—" She sighed. "Porter's brother-in-law works at the bank. Nothing stays private for long." Yates was quiet for a moment. "If you need to sell, I don't," she interrupted firmly. "This land was Robert's dream. It's all James would have inherited. I won't give it up without a fight." He nodded, respect evident in his eyes. "Then we'd better make sure those crops come in strong." In the weeks that followed, they worked harder than ever. Yates taught Penelope better irrigation techniques he'd learned working in the drought-prone areas of Texas. Together, they constructed a windmill to draw water from the deeper part of the creek. The garden flourished under their care, and the first shoots of corn and wheat began to green the fields. Every few days, they would visit the graves together. The flower seeds had sprouted, tiny green promises pushing through the soil. Penelope found that sharing her grief made it lighter somehow, and hearing Yates speak of his own lost family helped her understand she wasn't alone in her pain. One evening in late May, they returned from town with supplies to find the bunkhouse door swinging open and the interior ransacked. "Stay here," Yates ordered, drawing the revolver he carried but rarely displayed. He checked the small building thoroughly, then the barn and main house. "Nothing seems missing," he reported. "Just messed up. Warning, most like." Penelope hugged herself against a sudden chill. "Porter, probably, or his boys." Yates holstered his weapon. "I'll sleep in the barn tonight, keep watch." "No," Penelope said, surprising herself with her decisiveness. "The house has a spare room, Robert's study. You should stay there, for safety." Yates studied her face carefully. "You sure that's wise? Porter's already spreading talk." "Let him talk. I won't be intimidated in my own home." That night the house felt different with Yates under its roof. Penelope lay awake, listening to the unfamiliar creaks of another person moving in the next room. It wasn't fear she felt, but a strange awareness, as if the house itself had been holding its breath and was finally exhaling. The following weeks brought more incidents: a section of fence cut, allowing their milk cows to wander, a dead snake left on the porch, threatening notes nailed to the barn door. Yates remained in the house, his presence a deterrent against worse mischief. They fell into new routines. Yates would make coffee before Penelope awoke. She would prepare breakfast while he tended the animals. In the evenings, they would sit together on the porch or by the hearth, talking or reading from one of Robert's books. Sometimes they simply existed in comfortable silence, the kind that forms between people who no longer need words to communicate. June brought the first visit to the cemetery, where the flowers were actually blooming, tiny sunflowers stretching toward the sky, daisies opening their white faces to the sun. Penelope wept at the sight, but they were different tears than before, bittersweet rather than despairing. "Life keeps going," Yates said softly as they stood before the colorful graves. "Even when we think it can't possibly continue without them." Penelope nodded, wiping her eyes. "For the longest time I felt guilty for still being here when they weren't, for breathing when they couldn't." "I know that feeling." He touched a sunflower gently. "My Sarah used to say that grief is just love with nowhere to go." "That's beautiful." Penelope looked at him. "What was she like, your wife?" Yates smiled, a distant look in his eyes. "Fierce, kind, stubborn as the day is long." His gaze shifted to Penelope. "Reminds me of someone else I know." The comparison made her heart flutter in a way that both frightened and exhilarated her. Walking back to the farm, their hands brushed accidentally. Neither pulled away. By the time they reached the homestead, their fingers were intertwined, the contact sending warmth up Penelope's arm and into places in her heart she'd thought frozen forever. That night after supper, as they sat on the porch watching a spectacular sunset paint the prairie in gold and crimson, Penelope found the courage to ask what had been on her mind. "Yates, when Porter and his men are dealt with and the crops are harvested, will you move on?" The question hung between them, heavy with unspoken implications. Yates turned to her, his eyes reflecting the dying sunlight. "Do you want me to?" "No," she whispered, the admission both terrifying and liberating. "I don't." He reached for her hand, his touch gentle but sure. "Then I'll stay. For as long as you'll have me." "And if that's a very long time," a smile spread across his face, warming her more than any summer sun. "I've been wandering most of my life, Penelope. I think I've finally found where I belong." The kiss that followed was tentative at first, both of them carrying the ghosts of previous loves, both afraid of betraying memories held sacred. But as Yates's hand came up to cradle her cheek, Penelope felt something inside her unfurl, like the wildflowers on the graves reaching toward light after a long, dark winter. Later that night, a thunderstorm rolled across the prairie. Penelope sat at her window, watching lightning illuminate the land in stark flashes. A soft knock came at her door. "You all right?" Yates asked when she opened it. "You never did like storms." She blinked in surprise. "How did you know that? You grip your coffee cup tighter when thunder's coming." Move around the house, checking windows twice instead of once. The fact that he'd noticed such small details made her breath catch. "Robert used to sit up with me during storms," she admitted. "I've been alone through them since." Yates nodded in understanding. "Would you like company?" "Just to talk." They ended up sitting on the floor by the hearth, backs against Robert's old armchair, talking through the night as rain lashed the windows and thunder shook the small cabin. Penelope spoke of her fears of losing the farm, of dishonoring Robert's memory, of allowing herself happiness again. Yates listened, then shared his own journey through grief, the years of aimless wandering, the guilt of survival, the slow, painful process of allowing himself to feel again. "I think," he said as dawn began to lighten the sky, "that those we've lost would want us to live fully, to find joy again." "Do you really believe that?" she asked, her head resting against his shoulder. "I do." His arm tightened around her. "Your Robert sounds like a man who loved life." "Would he want you to stop living because he can't be here?" Penelope considered this, thinking of Robert's laugh, his endless enthusiasm, his delight in small pleasures. "No," she said finally. He wouldn't. As summer progressed, so did their relationship cautiously, respectfully, but with growing certainty. The farm flourished under their combined care. The wheat stood tall and golden, the corn grew high, and the garden yielded more vegetables than Penelope had seen since coming to Montana. Porter and his men continued their harassment, but with less frequency as it became clear that Yates wasn't leaving and Penelope wasn't selling. The sheriff, finally convinced to investigate, caught Porter's youngest son cutting another fence section and arrested him. In early August, Penelope and Yates stood in their wheat field, evaluating the crop that would soon be ready for harvest. "We'll need help bringing it in," Yates said, running wheat heads through his fingers. "Good yield this year." "The millers said they'd help if we help with their harvest after," Penelope replied. "And the Jensens offered their boys too," Yates smiled. "Seems you've got more friends than Porter thought." "We've got more friends," she corrected, taking his hand. "This is your home too now, Yates." The look he gave her made her heart soar. Wonder and gratitude and love all mingled together. "Never thought I'd have a home again," he said roughly. They were interrupted by the sound of approaching riders. Tensing, they turned to see three men approaching, not Porter and his sons, but strangers. "Stay behind me," Yates said quietly, his hand moving to his holster. But as the riders drew closer, Yates suddenly relaxed, a grin spreading across his face. "Well, I'll be damned." "Yates Blackburn, you old war dog," called the lead rider, a big man with a silver-streaked beard. "Thought that was you we spotted from the road." "Marcus Wilson," Yates laughed, stepping forward to greet them. "What brings you boys to these parts?" After introductions were made, Marcus explained they were former cavalry comrades of Yates, now working as ranch hands heading north to find work for the fall roundup. "You hiring, Blackburn?" Marcus asked with a wink. "Or are you still drifting yourself?" "Not drifting anymore," Yates answered, looking at Penelope with such naked adoration that she blushed. "Found my place right here." They invited the men to stay for a meal before continuing their journey. As they ate at the outdoor table Yates had built, Marcus regaled Penelope with stories of their time serving together. Yates's bravery, his skill with horses, his reputation for fairness even in the chaos of war. "Best scout in the regiment," Marcus concluded. "Saved my hide more than once." "He's still saving people," Penelope said softly, meeting Yates's eyes across the table. After the men departed with promises to visit again, Penelope and Yates walked to the hillside cemetery for their now regular evening visit. The graves were a riot of color sunflowers standing tall behind smaller blooms, creating a beautiful tapestry of life where death had left its mark. "I've been thinking," Yates said as they stood hand in hand before the graves, "about what you said about this being my home." Penelope looked up at him, suddenly nervous. "Yes." He turned to face her fully, taking both her hands in his. "I want to make it official if you'll have me, not just as your hired hand or your friend, but as your husband." Joy bubbled up inside her, but with it came a flicker of doubt. "Are you certain? I still love him, Yates. I always will, I know, just as I'll always love Sarah." He touched her cheek gently. "But I've found that my heart has room for both, for honoring her memory and for loving you now." Tears filled her eyes. "I've found the same." "Then, Penelope Lawson, will you marry me? Will you let me stand beside you for all the days to come, through harvests and plantings, through storms and sunshine?" "Yes," she whispered, then louder, "Yes, I will." As they sealed their promise with a kiss, the evening breeze rustled through the wildflowers on the graves, as if in blessing. The harvest came in bountiful and rich. With help from neighboring farms, the wheat and corn were gathered, threshed, and stored. Penelope paid the mortgage payment with money to spare, and Porter finally stopped his campaign to acquire her land when the sheriff made it clear further harassment would result in serious charges. They were married on a bright September day, with half the county in attendance. The ceremony took place beneath the old oak tree near the house, with a clear view of the hillside cemetery where colorful blooms still nodded in the early autumn breeze. Penelope wore a dress of pale blue rather than white, with wildflowers in her hair. Yates stood tall in a new suit, looking both nervous and more content than any of his old cavalry friends had ever seen him. Before the ceremony, they'd visited the graves together, placing fresh flowers and speaking quiet words to those they'd loved before. Not goodbyes, but reassurances that they were still remembered, still loved, still part of the tapestry of life that continued to unfold. "I think they'd be happy for us," Penelope had said, touching the crosses gently. "I believe they would," Yates agreed, his arm strong around her waist. Now, as they exchanged vows beneath the oak tree, Penelope felt a sense of rightness settle over her. This wasn't betraying Robert or replacing him, it was honoring the life he'd helped her build by continuing to live it fully, by opening her heart to new love. The celebration lasted well into the evening, with music and dancing in the yard. As twilight descended, Penelope found herself standing at the edge of the gathering, watching Yates laugh with their neighbors. "Penny for your thoughts, Mrs. Blackburn," he said, coming to join her. The new name sent a pleasant shiver through her. "I was just thinking about that day you found me at the cemetery, how close you came to just riding past." Yates pulled her close, resting his chin on top of her head. "Sometimes the most important journeys start with the smallest decisions. Like stopping to help a widow plant flowers, exactly like that." He turned her to face him, his eyes serious. "You know, when I saw you kneeling there that day, I thought you were digging graves for your hopes along with those seeds." "I was," she admitted. "I couldn't imagine anything growing again, not the farm, not happiness, nothing." And now, Penelope smiled up at him, her heart full of a love she'd never expected to find again. "Now I see that you helped me plant something else entirely. Not just flowers for the dead, but seeds of hope for the living." As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, they walked hand in hand back to the house they now shared, their shadows merging into one long silhouette against the golden light spilling from windows that no longer looked empty. Behind them on the hillside, wildflowers swayed in the evening breeze, vibrant life blooming from soil once watered only with tears, now tended with love and hope for all the seasons yet to come.